Let us move you closer. Thank you, I am quite all right. Stop being so accommodating, Catherine. It is easily done. Perhaps if we call for a footman on your chair. I am perfectly fine, Melinda. Will you never say a thing when I am sure you would rather? Catherine put a gloved hand on her friend's arm. I am rather thirsty, I suppose. Let me procure a glass of lemonade, Melinda exclaimed. Having found a way to be of use, she hurried away. Two fat matrons and a young man with a keen glint in his eye bore down upon her as soon as she reached the refreshment table. Catherine leant back on the pillows of the window seat and adjusted her shawl. Thank goodness Melinda was so easily distractible. Her constant flutter and anxiety were enough to give anyone the headache. It was true that their spot was some distance away from the stage, where the musicians were now tuning their instruments, but Catherine enjoyed the view of the milling crowd, the swish and swirl of silken gowns, the young men in pursuit of blushing girls guarded by dour chaperones. She had long been accustomed to the notion that she would never be one of those pretty hopefuls, and the covert glances cast in her direction did not bother her. She was a fixture on the Bath scene. The occasional pitying look invariably came from a newcomer. Her acquaintances certainly knew better than to direct any such sympathy her way. Melinda was blushing at the overtures of the young man. He offered his arm. She smiled and barely dipped her head in Catherine's direction. The young man turned slightly and caught Catherine's eye. The usual expression of polite sympathy crossed his face, and Catherine smiled automatically. It was a frozen smile, but it was the most she felt inclined to offer the curious. The man turned around again. When Catherine managed to catch Melinda's eye, she frowned to indicate that Melinda should stay where she was. Melinda gave her a grateful wave of acknowledgement. Catherine leant back again in her seat. It gave her some small pleasure to consider how annoyed Melinda's stepmamma would be if she knew that the very proper Lady Catherine Claverton was encouraging the attentions of some young man of unknown background. Melinda's stepmamma was a notoriously difficult person, prone to palpitations, who made it virtually impossible for Melinda to show herself in society. She would not accompany her stepdaughter herself and considered almost no one else appropriate. But she was willing to very grudgingly acknowledge that Lady Claverton's company was unexceptionable. Catherine accepted the role with good grace. At 24, she was really far too young to be anyone's chaperone, but no one had ever regarded her as a girl. And she didn't mind being passed over by the gentleman. Melinda needed her. It was a pleasure to be needed. She adjusted the skirts of her gown. One could at least wear pretty clothes, she reflected, even if one could not be a beauty. She turned slightly in her seat, running a critical eye over the crowd. The room was filling. Most of the faces were familiar. Stuffy old Bath, with its outmoded social rules. It was bound to be a dull evening. Loud laughter beckoned, and she glanced in the direction of the door. Unfamiliar faces. She peered at them from behind the lacy shade of the window seat curtains. Two pretty girls, not likely to be much past their coming out. Two men in naval uniform. One leant over, whispered conspiratorially to the girls. They tittered loudly. The other officer hung back, looking somewhat uncomfortable. He scanned the room as if he expected to find someone he knew there. "Look, John, seats!" One of the girls tapped the arm of the officer at her side with her fan and headed off into the crowd, pulling her friend behind her. "Fanny, wait!" the officer called in alarm. He looked back at his colleague, who was still surveying the gathering. "You go ahead," the other officer said. "Silly chit," his friend muttered, taking off after the two girls at a rapid clip.